You write, quote, "We'll start our pitchfork tour in this chapter by taking a brief trip through the history of the Republican Party. Then, in the following chapters, we'll take a Tim's career-tanking deep dive into America's social justice movement," as you started to talk about. Okay, so let's go. What's the history of the Republican Party?
I'm looking at this through my vertical ladder. I'm saying, what is this familiar story of the Republicans from the 60s to today? What does it look like through the vertical lens, right? Does it look different? And is there an interesting story here that's been kind of hidden because we're always looking at the horizontal? Now, the horizontal story, you'll hear people talk about it, and they'll say something like the Republicans have moved farther and farther to the right. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's not really true. Like, was Trump more right wing than Reagan? I don't think so. I think he's less
actual policy. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're using this again. It's just like you're calling yourself centrist when it's not exactly what you mean, even though it also is.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, look, this vertical lens helps with other things. Let's apply it to the Republicans. And here's what I saw is I looked at the 60s and I saw an interesting story, which is I don't think that, not everyone's familiar with like what happened in the early 60s, but in 1960, the Republican Party was it was a plurality. You had progressives, like genuine, Rockefeller, pretty progressive people, all the way to, then you had the, moderates like Eisenhower and Dewey. And then you go all the way to the, farther right, you had Goldwater and, what we might call, I call them the fundamentalists. And so it's this interesting plurality, right? Something we don't have today. And what happened was the Goldwater contingent, which was the underdog, they were small, right? Eisenhower was the president, had just been the president, and it seemed like the moderates were, he said you have to be close to the center of the chessboard. That's how you maintain power. These people were very far from the center of the chessboard, but they ended up basically have like a hostile takeover. They conquered their own party, and they did it by breaking all of the kind of unwritten rules and norms. So they did things like they first started with like the college Republicans, which was like this feeder group that turned in, a lot of the politicians started there. And they went to the election and they wouldn't let the current president, the incumbent, speak. And they were throwing chairs and they were fistfights. And eventually people gave up and they just sat there and they sat in the chair talking for, their candidate until everyone eventually left, and then they declared victory. So they came in. There was a certain set of rules, agreed upon rules, and they came in playing the power games, saying, "Well, actually, if we do this, you won't have the power. We have the power to take it if we just break all the rules, right?" And so they did, and they won, and that became a hugely influential thing. Which then they conquered California through, again, these people were taken aback. These proper Republican candidates were appalled by the kind of like the insults that were being hurled at them and the intimidation and the bullying. And eventually they ended up in the National Convention, which was called like the right-wing Woodstock. It was like, the Republican National Convention in 1964 was just, there was jeering, and they wouldn't let the moderates or the progressives even speak. And there was racism. Jackie Robinson was there, and he was a proud Republican. And he said that like, he feels like he was a Jew in Hitler's Germany with the way that blacks were being treated there. And it was nasty. But what did they do? They had fiery, plurality enough to win, and they won. They ended up getting crushed in the general election, and they kind of faded away. But to me, I was like, that was an interesting story. I see it as, I have this character in the book called the Golem, which is a big, dumb, powerful monster that's the emergent property of like a political echo chamber. It's like this big giant. It's stupid, but it's powerful and scary. And to me, I was like, a golem rose up, conquered the party for a second, knocked it on its ass, and then faded away. Mm-hmm. And to me, when I look at the Trump revolution and not just Trump, the last 20 years, I see that same lower right monster kind of making another charge for it, but this time succeeding and really taking over the party for a long period of time. I see the same story, which is the power games are being played in a situation when it had always been, the government relies on all these unwritten rules and norms to function. But for example, you have in 2016, Merrick Garland gets nominated by Obama, and the unwritten norm says that when the president nominates a justice, then you pass them through unless there's some egregious thing. That's what has happened. But they said, actually, this is the last year of his presidency and the people should choose. I don't think we should set a new precedent where the president can't nominate a Supreme Court justice in the last year. So they pass it through, and it ends up being Gorsuch. And so they lose that seat. Now, 3 years later, it's Trump's last year, and it's another election year, and Ginsburg dies. And what did they say? They say, oh, let's keep our precedent. They said, no, actually, we changed our mind. We're going to nominate Amy Barrett. So to me, that is classic power games, right? There's no actual rule. And what you're doing is they did technically have the power to block the nomination then, and then they technically had the power to put someone, and they're pretending there's some principle to it, but they're just they're going for a short-term edge at the expense of what is like the workings of the system in the long run. And then what do the Democrats have to do in that situation? Because both parties have been doing this, is they either can lose now all the time or they start playing the power games too. And now you have a prisoner's dilemma where it's like both end up doing this thing and everyone ends up worse off. The debt ceiling, all these power plays that are being made where these holding the country hostage, this is power games. And to me, that's what Goldwater was doing in the 60s, but it was a healthier time in a way because there was this plurality within the parties, reduced some of the national tribalism, and that there wasn't as much of an appeal to that. But today, it's just like, do whatever you have to do to beat the enemies. And so I'm seeing a rise in power games. And I talk about the Republicans because they did a lot of these things first. They have been a little bit more egregious, but both parties have been doing it over the last 20, 30 years.
Can you place blame, or maybe there's a different term for it, at the subsystems of this? So is it the media? Is it the politicians like in the Senate and in Congress? Is it Trump, so the leadership? Is it, or maybe it's us, human beings? Maybe social media versus mainstream media. Is there a sense of what is the cause and what is the symptom?
It's very complex. So Ezra Klein has a great book, Why We're Polarized, where he talks about a lot of this. And there's some of these are, it's really no one's fault. First of all, it's the environment has changed in a bunch of ways you just mentioned. And what happens when you take human nature, which is a constant, and you put it into an environment, behavior comes out. The environment's the independent variable. When that changes, the dependent variable, the behavior, changes with it, right? And so the environment has changed in a lot of ways. So one major one is it used to, for a long time, actually, the first it was the Republicans and then the Democrats just had a stranglehold on on Congress. It was not even competitive. The Democrats for 40 years had the majority. And so therefore, it actually is a decent environment to compromise in. Because now we can both, what you want is Congress people thinking about their home district and voting yes on a national policy because we're going to get a good deal on it back at home. That's actually healthy, as opposed to voting in lockstep together because this is what the red party is doing, regardless of what's good for my home district. An example is Obamacare. There were certain Republican districts that would have actually officially been benefited by Obamacare, but every Republican voted against it. So, and part of the reason is because there's no longer this obvious majority. Every few years it switches. It's a 50-50 thing. And that's, partially because it's become so, we've been so subsumed with this one national divide of left versus right that people are whoever, they're voting for the same party for president all the way down the ticket now. And so you have this just kind of 50-50 color war, and that's awful for compromise. So there's like 10 of these things, that have redistricting. But also, it is social media. It is, I call it hypercharged tribalism. In the 60s, you had kind of distributed tribalism. You had some people that are worked up about the USSR, right? They're national. That's what they care about. U.S. versus foreign. You had some people that were saying left versus right, like they are today. And then other people that were saying that they were fighting within the party. Mm-hmm. But today you don't have that. You have ideological realignment, so you kind of got rid of a lot of the in-party fighting, and then hasn't been that big of a foreign threat, nothing like the USSR for a long time. So you kind of lost that, and what's left is just this left versus right thing, and so that's kind of this hypercharged whirlpool that subsumes everything, and so it's. I mean, people point to Newt Gingrich. And people like there's certain characters that enacted policies that stoked this kind of thing. But I think this is a much bigger kind of environmental shift.
Well, that's going back to our questions about the role of individuals in human history. So one of the many interesting questions here is about Trump. Is he a symptom or a cause? Because he seems to be, from the public narrative, such a significant catalyst for some of the things we're seeing.
This goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Like, is it the person or is it the times? I think he's a perfect example of it's a both situation. I don't think if you plucked Trump out of this situation, I don't think Trump was inevitable, but I think we were very vulnerable to a demagogue. And if you hadn't been, Trump would have had no chance. Yeah. And why were we vulnerable to a demagogue is because you have these, well, I mean, I think specifically on the right, if you actually look at the stats, it's pretty bad. Like the people who, because it's not just who voted for Trump. A lot of people just vote for the red, right? What's interesting is who voted for Obama against Romney and then voted for Trump. Who these are not racists, right? These are not hardcore Republicans. They voted for Obama. And where did the switch come from? Places that had economic despair, where bridges were not working well. That's a signifier, where paint's chipping in the schools, these little things like this. So I think that, you had a lot of these kind of rural towns, you have true despair. And then you also have the number one indicator of voting for Trump was distrust in media. And the media has become much less trustworthy, and so you have all these ingredients that actually make us very vulnerable to a demagogue, and a demagogue is someone who takes advantage, right? There's someone who comes in and says, "I can pull all the right strings and pull and push all the right emotional buttons right now and get myself power by taking advantage of the circumstances," and that is what Trump totally did.
It makes me wonder how easy it is for somebody who's a charismatic leader to capitalize on cultural resentment when there's economic hardship, to channel that.
So John Haidt wrote a great article about like we truth is at an all-time low right now. Like the media is not penalized for lying.
Yeah.
Right? MSNBC, Fox News, these are not penalized for being inaccurate. They're penalized if they stray from the orthodoxy. On social media, it's not the truest tweets that go viral, right? And so Trump understood that better than anyone, right? He took advantage of it. He was living in the current world when everyone else was stuck in the past. And he saw that and he just lied. Everything he said, the truth was not relevant at all, right? It's just truly, it's not relevant to him when what he's talking about. He doesn't care. And he knew that neither do a subset of the country.
I was thinking about this, just reading articles by journalists, especially when you're not a famous journalist in yourself, but you're more like a New York Times journalist. So the big famous thing is the institution you're part of. That they're like, you can just lie, because you're not going to get punished for it. You're going to be rewarded for the popularity of an article. So if you write 10 articles, there's a huge incentive to just make stuff up.
You got to get clicks.
That's first and foremost. And like culturally, people will attack that article to say it's dishonest. Like one half the country will attack that article for saying it's dishonest, but they'll kind of forget you will not have a reputational hit.
Right.
There won't be a memory like this person made up a lot of stuff in the past. No, they'll take one article at a time, and they'll attach the reputation hits will be to New York Times, the institution.
Yeah.
And so for the individual journalist, there's a huge incentive to make stuff up.
Totally. It's scary because it's almost like you can't survive if you're just an old school, honest journalist who really works hard and tries to get it right and does it with nuance. Like what you can be a big time Substacker or big time podcaster. A lot of people do have a reputation for accuracy and rigor, and they have huge audiences. But if you're working in a big company right now, I think that many of the big media brands are very much controlled by the left, but I will say that the ones that are controlled by the right are even more egregious, not just in terms of accuracy, but also in terms of, the New York Times, for all of its criticisms, they have a handful of they here and there they put out a pretty an article that strays from Barry Weiss wrote there for a long time, and then you've got. They wrote an article criticizing free speech on campus stuff, recently. And they have a couple very, left, progressive friendly conservatives, but they have conservatives that are writing the op-eds. Fox News, you're not seeing thoughtful, Breitbart. You're not seeing thoughtful progressives writing there, right?
There's some degree to which the New York Times, I think, still incentivizes and values the the high effort. So you're allowed to have a conservative opinion if you do a really damn good job.
Yeah.
Like if it's a very thorough, in-depth kind of
And
article.
if you kind of pander to the
A little bit,
progressive
yeah, right.
senses in all the right ways. I always joke that, at TED, they always have a couple, token conservatives, but they get on stage and they're basically like, so totally, you're all, where the progressivisms it's right about all of this, but maybe, libertarianism isn't all bad. It's this.
Right.
So there is an element, but you know what? It's something. It's better than being a total tribal. I think you can see the New York Times tug of war, the internal tug of war. You can see it because then they also have these awful instances, or like the firing of James Bennett, which is this whole other story. But like they have, you can see it going both ways. But in the 60s, what did you have? You had ABC, NBC, CBS. The 70s, you had these 3 news channels, and they weren't always right, and they definitely sometimes spun a narrative together, maybe about the Vietnam or whatever, but if one of them was just lying, they'd be embarrassed for it. They would be penalized. They'd be dinged, and they'd be known as this is the trash one. And that would be terrible for their ratings because they weren't just catering to half the country. They all were catering to the whole country. So both on the axis of accuracy and on the axis of neutrality, they had to, try to stay somewhere in the reasonable range. And that's just gone.
One of the things I'm really curious about is I think your book is incredible. I'm very curious to see how it's written about by the press. Because I could myself write, with the help of ChatGPT, of course, clickbait articles in either direction.
Yeah. It's easy to imagine.
Your whole book is beautifully written for clickbait articles.
Yeah.
If any journalists out there need help, I can help.
Yeah.
I can write out the most atrocious criticisms.
Yeah. I'm ready. I'm braced.